I'm Karen Johnson, and now I'm going to show you the blanket stitch. Some people call this the buttonhole stitch. This is machine applique, and the first thing you have to do is make sure that you have that stitch on your machine. My machine actually has 3 or 4 different versions of it, so you need to play with your machine and understand your stitch before you ever get to the applique itself. So I'm going to just take a few stitches with my blanket stitch to see what it does and see if I like what it's doing. This is important because you need to learn the positions of your needle. You can see mine, it's pretty simple. I've used the simplest of it. It's just going forward 1, down, taking a jag, coming back down, forward 1, down. But one of my other stitches does something like 3 stitches and then down, and then it goes backwards, and then it takes a 2-step jag. And for good blanket applique, you need to know where your machine's going to go and when. So I strongly recommend that you practice and adjust. So I'm going to adjust my stitch down just a little bit. So I've adjusted it a tiny little bit, and that's about where I want it to be. So here's what it looks like, the difference between the 2 stitches with a minor adjustment on my machine. And every machine's different, so I'm not going to show you how I adjusted it because yours is going to be different. But in the first case, it was a little bit wider, a little bit deeper. The second case was just a little bit shallower stitch. I wanted something a little bit more delicate. This is really just personal preference, but also consider the project you're working on. If you have several tiny little leaves, you might want to go with a smaller stitch because on those tiny points, you'll need a little less thread to get around those corners. So adjust it, and then really practice a few minutes to get familiar with exactly where those stitches are going to go. Because when you get to corners and inside corners, you really need to know when you turn your piece where the next stitch is going to be. So it's important that you be familiar with your particular blanket stitch on your machine so that you know what to expect. Okay, so now I'm going to actually do the applique. In this case, I'm doing this on fusible, which means I've got steam seam right up to the very edge, but you can also do it on a turned edge. I don't recommend the method I showed you where the freezer paper stays in the paper because the nature of the blanket stitch, it's hard to rip that paper out later, but it works really well if you've turned the edge. So, before I begin stitching, I've put my needle in the needle down position, and again, as I said, you really need to know your stitch and what it's going to do. I know that my needle is currently in the right position, so that means that I'm in the outer edge position, the edge that's going to cover the raw part. So I know that this is where I want my needle to be, and now I can just begin stitching. I always hold my thread firmly for that first stitch. Now, when you are going around a curve, I recommend that you do not turn the piece when your needle is in that what I call the bite position. I recommend that you turn it when it's in that position. Otherwise you're going to get a bit of a V on that bite, and you don't want the V, you want it to be nice and straight. I'll show you what it looks like. In the next one I'll do it wrong. So then if I turn it, you get a bit of a V. That's not very exaggerated, but it will happen. So again, because I'm going around a curve, I'm taking this very slowly, and I'm lifting my foot pretty regularly, and I'm just following along the edge. It's very simple, and it looks very nice. I'm going to cut this thread so you can see it. It's a very nice finished blanket stitch. I'm using contrasting thread on purpose. The angle of these bites will depend on how fast you turned. If I turn too fast, it's going to be angled a little bit more, and what you're looking for is some uniformity. But if you take it slow, it's very easy to get a nice, simple stitch. Okay, so now I'm approaching an inside point, and that does take just a little bit of extra care as you approach that. So I'm going to slowly get to that point, and depending on the size stitch you're using, you don't always get to exactly the right spot that you want it to be. So sometimes you have to fudge just a little bit, and it looks like that's going to happen for me. So I'm taking 1 stitch before the point, and then I'm thinking about, I know that that next stitch is going to come in a little deeper, so I'm just going to take the stitch go in the down position, and it's ready to take that left bite again, and so I've turned it so that it's, I don't know how to say that, is that perpendicular? So you can see what I just did. So from the point in, it's a straight shot, and then when I'm back in that corner again, I'm going to pivot and take the next stitch. And I'll show you, let me just get 2 stitches past so you can see. So your goal is to just get, let me get that thread out of the way, is to try to make that even on both sides in whatever position you choose to. You could also try to make it in the same position, kind of like a little bird's foot, the 3 position, or the bottom half of a peace sign. But I like to keep it fairly simple so there's not a lot of thread around that edge. But all I did was pivot right at the very tip of that point. If you your needle doesn't land right at that tip, I actually just kind of fake it out and lift my foot and reposition the needle so that it's right there, so that the space between here and here might be just a tiny bit different than from here to here, but it's not going to be noticeable. Okay, now I'm going to demonstrate a sharp tipped point, like in leaves. Now, the leaf I'm doing today is a particularly sharp point. Most of the time you're probably not going to encounter something this sharp, and you will end up with some extra stitches that aren't great. So I'm going to try to keep the extra stitches to a minimum by cleverly repositioning my needle each time I get to that tip. So I'm going to move my way up to the tip, and I have a slightly shorter stitch length on this than I did on the flower because this is a smaller piece, and as you can see as I approach that tip there's not an awful lot of space. So I'm going to get to the tip, move it a little bit, and as you can see it's going to take up some space on this tip. So I'm going to get as close to the tip as I possibly can, and that's probably, I'm going to try one more. I'll just talk out loud as I talk to you. Now I'm at the very tip, and I'm going to turn it. And again, this is the point where I know that my machine is going to take a left bite. So I've turned it so that that left bite actually is going to go over that last stitch. See how I did that? And then I'm back in the down position. And now I'm going to turn it completely so that the next stitch is going down. Now I am going to get some overlap right here just because there's just not enough room for all those stitches. But I've reduced some of it so that there's not as much as there would have been. And I'll show you how it looks in a second here. Take a couple more stitches so we can get away from the edge. So you can see that there's some extra thread in there. It's not horrible. Those sharp tips with a machine, you're going to have a little less control. Some people like to switch to a straight stitch and come down around that edge with a straight, but in my sewing machine's case, my needle is always in a left or right position, and so it feels uncomfortable to me to move it around too much. So I accept just a little extra thread holding down that tip. So that's an outie, you've seen an innie, and that's the blanket stitch.